If you're making a coat or a jacket out of a wool like this, you're not going to want to do a machined buttonhole at the end. It's quite tricky when you're using a really bulky fabric. So what do you use? A piped buttonhole or a bound buttonhole is my choice for a really good finish and being easy to do. It's a lot easier than you would think. The other option you could do is a hand stitch buttonhole. If anyone wants to know how to do that, then do please say in the comments, because that's another tutorial that I could do. So there are both bound buttonholes and piped buttonholes, and I was taught the terms for each of these, but I've discovered online that the two names seem to be interchangeable. Some people call what I call a piped buttonhole a bound buttonhole, and vice versa. So I've got a couple of samples that I'm going to show you how to make. So this is what I call a bound buttonhole, and this is the piped buttonhole. I'll show you both of these one at a time, how to do them and how to work out what size to do them with your buttons. So these buttonholes I find are perfect for fabrics like this. You can get the buttonholes done before assembling your coat. It's great because I always hate making something and then right at the end, that last little bit is the buttonholes, and I always think, crikey, am I going to mess this up right at the end? You get them done first. You get that little fiddly bit done first, which is brilliant. So they can feel a little bit bulkier than a machine stitched buttonhole because you are using extra bits of fabric to do the piped bits or the bound bit, whatever you want to call it. But once you've given them a press and actually you've got your few layers down the placket of your coat, you don't notice it. But I've made coats with these buttonholes and used them for years and they still stay perfect. It's a really nice, neat finish that is long lasting. So in this tutorial, I'm not using any kind of interfacing, but realistically, when you're making something like this, you're going to need some kind of interfacing down your placket to give it the structure that it needs. But I'm just not showing it in this because I want to keep this just about the buttonholes. I'll talk very briefly on the spacing from where your centre front is and the edge of your placket to where your buttonhole and your button goes. But that's kind of as much detail as I want to go into in this, because this is just about the actual structure of the buttonhole. But just to kind of show you very basically, my centre front line is where the buttons go here. And my buttonholes, they go slightly over from my centre front because it just needs a little bit of room from the shank, either where you've sewn it on for the thread or the plastic if you've got a button with a shank on it. It needs that little bit to go over, and I will explain what size to make it. You basically need, if I grab one of my buttons, you basically need the diameter of your button, so from one side to the other, plus the depth as well, and that will be enough to get your button through. But always do a practice run. I would never make a buttonhole like this without doing a trial run and making sure my button passes through. And at the same time, there's not too much give. You don't want your buttonholes to be too big. You want it to fit perfectly. And lastly, of course, the direction of the buttonholes. The standard way of doing a buttonhole on a coat or a jacket or something like this is that your buttonholes run across this way. It's not like a shirt where they run down the placket. They generally run across. Obviously, if you want to do it differently, that's up to you with your design, but that's the standard way of doing it. And when I make a coat for a female, I have the buttonholes on this side, so on the wearer's right side, and the buttons on the wearer's left side. And the traditional way for a man is for it to go the opposite direction. But obviously, that's down to personal choice. You don't have to have it this way at all. I think it's just one of those traditional things that has been around for years. So this is both of the buttonholes. So this one is what I call a piped buttonhole, and this is a bound buttonhole. And I've used a fairly big button because it just gets really fiddly if not when I'm doing a demonstration. So that's basically the buttonhole working. And if you look at the other side, they're just slightly different. So I'm going to show you one at a time what you have to do to make these. So I tend to use a piped buttonhole, or what I call a piped buttonhole, when I'm using a flatter fabric or just not so bulky. And then when I'm using quite a big, thick, bulky fabric, these are a bit fiddly to do with this fabric, so I tend to use a bound buttonhole. But they both look exactly the same from the outside, and then they are very slightly different on the inside. The best thing to do, I would say, is to just try both of them out when you've got your fabric and just see which one you find the easiest to do. They're going to look exactly the same either way. And then I'll show you also how to finish them off. You're going to end up doing a little slit on your facing, and then that sews around there. So if I just fold that on the inside, you're basically going to have on either side it neatly finished off like this, which you'll just hand sew. So let's just do these one at a time, how to do them for this button. So the first one I'm going to show you is what I call a piped buttonhole. So if I go to the other side, you can see here you have these two pieces. So I've sewn these on separately, and I'll show you how to put them on and then how to turn them out and finish off this buttonhole. So the first thing you're going to need to do is work out the size, and what you need is the diameter of your button and you need the depth of your button, and you add both of those together and that tells you how long this needs to be. And then it's kind of up to you how wide you do it. The skinnier these little bits are, if I show you on this one it's a bit easier to see, the skinnier these bits are, the more fiddly it is to make. So just do a test run. So on mine, these are 4mm either side. So the total width of this is 8mm. And I've done exactly the same on both buttonholes. So I am going to do another buttonhole exactly the same on here. The first thing you need to do is decide where your buttonhole goes. So I'm going to line it up with the one that I've already done. And I'm just going to put a pin where either end is like this. I'll just double check it's the right width. So 3.8 is what I need, and that's exactly what it measures. And then I need to work out where it's going across. So all I'm going to do, and obviously you can really take your time doing this when you're doing it on an actual garment. You could use tailor's chalk, a disappearing pen. You can use whatever you like, but what I prefer to do is do a bit of tacking. So I've just put those pins in just to show exactly where it goes. And then I'm just going to do some big stitches in a contrast colour to mark exactly where the centre line of my buttonhole goes. And you don't need to perfectly space these stitches, you just need to make sure it's a straight line. So that's all I need to do, and you can obviously just take that out a little bit further. So that is the position of the centre, so basically where the opening goes. And that is how long it needs to be either end. So I'm not going to do anything with those pins for now. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to prepare my little bits that I'm doing. So it's called a piped buttonhole, but you don't have to put piping in it. You can put piping in if you want to, but when you're using a fabric like this, you really don't need to. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this and then I'm just going to use it like this. So you can see this is quite skinny. If you're using a bulky fabric, it can get quite fiddly. So the total width of my buttonhole with both bits together is 8mm. So you need this to be double that measurement, so 16mm. And then I've added on a tiny bit because when you fold it, you do lose a little bit. So when I fold that, it should be the width of the finished buttonhole there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just stitch this together to make life nice and easy. You don't have to. If you've got a fabric where you can actually just press this down and it will stay in place, you can do that. But my fabric doesn't stay very well with pressing because it's not a natural fibre. So I'm just going to stitch this to make it nice and easy for myself. So before I sew that, I'm just going to cut two pieces that are a bit longer than what I actually need. I don't need to sew any more than I need to. So I need to make sure that I've got the right side on the outside, and it's really hard to see with this fabric because it actually just looks pretty much the same. So I'm just folding it in half, and you can do this on the machine if you want, but actually it's so quick just to do some big stitches, and then you can pull all of these out once you're done. And that's it, that's all I need to do, and I'm just going to do exactly the same with this one. And now what I'll do in a second is I'm going to sew both of these onto my base fabric, and I need the join in the middle, but to make sure they're perfectly spaced, I'm just using a different colour now to do my hand stitching. I am just gonna stitch these together. I'm trying to make sure I don't accidentally fray my fabric because I've obviously just got raw edges on here, so I'm only doing really loose stitches, and you want to try not to go past the centre points because you'll see in a second that's where I'm going to sew these on. But I just find by doing this, and you don't have to do all these steps, but it just helps me to demonstrate what to do. And if you've never done it before, all of these little steps, as much as you might think, oh, I'm going to cut corners and not do it, quite often it saves you time because you get it right first time rather than having to unpick things, which can be so frustrating. So all I'm doing is a few little stitches just to hold those together, and I'm not going all the way through, I'm literally just going through that side. And I can now trim that off, and what I need to do, just realise I've not put that very straight, so straighten that up, and I just need to basically line up this part here where they join with my stitched line. So if you, when you put this on, extend it past, you'll see it coming out of the end. So it just needs to go on here like this. And then what I need to do is I need to stitch this on down the centres of these. So I am going to just put a couple of pins in this side to hold this one on, and then flip it round and do the same on that side. You can tack this as well if you want, but you just end up with so much tacking it gets a bit silly. So that is now well and truly pinned on. Just make sure you don't stretch anything. You can even put some interfacing on this if you want to when you're doing it for real, to make sure it doesn't stretch out. I just don't want to add any more bulk than I need to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew down the centres from pin to pin. So you could put some tacking across there if you want, but what you don't want to be doing is loads of stitching and then you're sewing over your tacking and you're struggling to get it out. So it depends on what your sewing skill level is as to whether you want to tack this or just use some pins. Basically what I need to do is down this side here, I need to sew down the centre, and I've already worked out with my foot what I can line it up with. So what I'm doing is I've already worked this out, that to get it in the centre, I basically need to line up either side of this, just this one side, with where the clear bit is on my foot here. And I need to start it where this pin is going across. So I think I'm going to have to take that one out. It's just going to be too tricky to do it with it in. And I need to make sure I've got it in the right position. And I'm just going to hand wind my needle down. Help if I had my glasses on, I could see what I was doing. And I'm just going to kind of jiggle this around until I get it in exactly the right place. So that's where it needs to start. I've noticed now that pin's going to get in the way, so I'm just going to take that one out. And what I need to do, I've got a computerized machine that will automatically finish in the down position as I sew. If you haven't, just do this by hand. So I'm just doing a couple of stitches forward, and I'm going to do a couple of back stitches as well, because I don't want this coming undone. And now I can sew the length of this. I've just realised my stitch is a bit short. I'm just making that a little bit bigger. I'm going to do it on 2.8, and I am just going to really take my time making sure this goes down the centre on this side, and then I need to finish where that pin is there. So I'm going to put this one in there, and then I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches on this end too. If you don't do that, it's not going to be very secure. So I need to just take it off now and have a good close look and make sure that I've got everything sewn up in exactly the right place. So if I hold this up here nice and close, you can see where the pin is there, and that's where my stitching finishes, and you can see the same on this side. So that's what you need to double check. And now all I need to do is exactly the same down this side. So that's now sewn on both sides. You can see the stitching from that side. So what I can do now is I can get rid of all of my tacking. I don't need that. So that was just a bit marking out where it needs to go. And I can pull all of that out. And then all of this can come out too. So that looks a lot neater and clearer now that tacking has gone. So I've obviously put these on way longer than they need to be, so I can trim a little bit of that off now, but you don't need to trim loads off at this stage. I always think just leave any excess on because it's a little bit less fiddly, and then you can just trim everything at the end. So we need to go to the other side to work out what we need to cut. And this is the point where you really don't want to make a mistake. So make sure it's all sewn on exactly how you want it. And you just need to kind of start snipping in the middle. I just tend to fold it and do it like that. You can get some really pointy little scissors if you need them, but I just tend to use regular scissors. And then you need to cut into the corners. So you end up with, I'm trying to make sure I don't get this so close it goes blurry, but you end up with this little V shape at the end, and you're cutting right to the ends of where you've sewn it on. So you just need to cut like that at either end. And now that I've done that, I can put these through. So this is now the right side, and you'll see the buttonhole now taking shape. So it might seem quite fiddly and difficult at first, but actually it's really not that fiddly once you get the hang of them. So we're almost done. So what I need to do now is I need to put some little stitches in from this side. And then what you can do if you want to as well, you can hand sew it to the back of that if you want to, but I always find once it's had a little bit of a press and then you get your facing on, which I will show you in a minute once I've done both buttonholes, kind of holds it in place anyway. But the bit that isn't stitched yet is either end here. So I am going to show you exactly how to do that. You need these to stay in place. So again, you don't have to do this step if you don't want to, but if you do, it will make sure that everything stays in place perfectly. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to do just a bit like what I did before. I'm just going to put some tacking in here, just holding these together, and it just means it's going to help it stay perfect while I stitch across the end. So where I cut those little triangles, I'm basically going to stitch those down, and hopefully I can get close enough with the camera to show you exactly what I'm doing. So there we go. That is that just kind of tacked together. If you're making something, I would use the same colour thread, because if you leave any little fibres, you don't want to contrast, but I want you to see what I'm doing. So that's now all held in place, and it just makes it that little bit easier for me to finish this off. Okay, so I've zoomed in quite a way because I really want you to see what I'm doing, and I'm hoping that my hands aren't going to get in the way and this is going to stay focused. So because I did the tacking, these two bits are staying well together. And what I want to do, if I get a little pin to point to it so you can really see it, you've got this little triangle here, and that's the bit that when I cut it and I said cut the triangle, this is what you're left with. And I've put the zip foot on because it means I can get nice and close, and I'm going to also move my needle over a little bit so it's now lined up with that. And what I want to do is I'm going to start in the middle. So I've dropped my foot, put my needle down, and I'm going to hold these bits here. I don't want these to move, and I'm just going to sew along there, and then I'm going to go back as well, and I'm holding it. It doesn't look like I'm doing it, but I'm kind of squeezing it a little bit with these fingers as well, because I want to make sure nothing slips, and make sure you don't sew too far to the left, because it's all going to end up getting caught on the other side and it's not going to look right. And that's all you need to do to fix this little triangle bit here. If that is too fiddly for you, just do it by hand. So I'm going to do the other side exactly the same, and then we can see how it looks. And there we go, that's now all sewn on. So you can see the ends look nice and neat, and it's all staying in place. But obviously we can't use this yet because it has been sewn up. So the last bit to do is just take out that tacking, and then I can try it out. Oops, I've obviously sewn over my tacking at that point there. So try not to do that because it makes it harder to get it out. And that's my finished piped buttonhole. So the moment of truth is, does my button fit in without too much space? And there you go, it fits perfectly. That's why you need the length plus the thickness of your button to make sure it goes through nicely. If that's your centre front line, let's just put a pin in. If I was using this button, I would have my buttonhole going slightly over from where my centre front is, so that once it's done up, it sits like that, and you just see the little bit of buttonhole coming out of the side. So I will show you how to finish it off on the other side when you put your facing on. Obviously, if that was a placket, you would have a facing behind it, but I'm going to show you first how to do the other buttonhole. So hopefully you found that easier than you thought it would be. I'm going to show you now with this fabric, which is a bit bulkier, how to do what I call a bound buttonhole. So I'll show you again how to work out the size, how to put it together. This is what it looks like from the other side. And then I'll show you how to finish off what would be the facing underneath the placket of your centre front on your coat. For both of these, it's exactly the same process, so you get a perfect finish. It might look when I sew this like this method is a little bit easier. It really depends on what fabric you're using. I would suggest if you're making any kind of coat like this, try out both methods, just see what you find easier with the bulk of your fabric and what works better with your fabric as well. There's pros and cons to both of these, but they both work perfectly fine for all kinds of coats and jackets. So let's have a look now at the bound buttonhole. So as I said, it looks exactly the same from the outside. It's just a slightly different technique. And I just find with bulky fabrics, sometimes this is a bit less fiddly. You just need to try it out with your fabric and see what you want to do. So I'm just going to do another buttonhole. It's going to be the same size as the last one, and I'm going to just do it below here. So what you need to do firstly is you just need a little square of fabric. It needs to be plenty wide enough to go around your buttonhole, and just make it a little bit higher either end. You don't need to work out the exact size. So I'm just going to put my buttonhole down here, and I'm putting the right sides together. And what I'm doing, just to make life nice and easy, is I'm just going to tack this onto here with some big stitches, and it's just going to make it less fiddly when I come to sewing it. And that's it. It only needs to be rough. You can pin it on if you want to, but it's just as quick really to do that. And I find with pins, it can mean that your fabric kind of moves up like that. It just lays a lot flatter with some stitching. So that's the first thing I need to do. And then unlike the other one, I'm going to sew the actual shape of the opening. So let's do this with some pins first. I'm going to try and line it up with my previous one. All my pins are bent. Right, so that is one end, and then 3.8 centimetres goes to the other end, and that lines up with that. So that is either end of my buttonhole, and then this is the centre point. So these 2 points here mark the end of it, and then this is the centre. But I need to sew a rectangle that I'm then going to cut out, and it's going to be the opening. I don't want to be sewing with all of these pins, but equally I don't want to do loads of tacking where I'm sewing, because then you end up sewing over your tacking, and it's a little bit of a pain to get out. So all I'm going to do to start with is I'm just going to sew a line down the centre. And then what I can do is I can line up my foot. I've actually got the foot off the machine so I can show you. So if that's my centre, if I line that up with the bit of the foot there, I know that I'm going to be sewing in the right position. So if I just tack a line down the middle, it means I can take these pins out, and it's just going to be a little bit easier. And I don't even need to sew through both layers when I do this tacking. I can literally just sew through this top layer. So I've got that marked out now where the centre is. I can get on my sewing machine and I can sew these bits here. You can put tacking lines across the bottom and the top if you want to, but I'm going to just do this with the pins for this bit here. So I want to sew this on, and I'm lining it up, as I said, with where the silver bit and the see-through bit on my foot goes. I've just measured it and I know that's the right place. So I need to make sure my needle's in the centre. And I've got a 2.8 stitch length because it's quite a bulky fabric. And what I don't want to do is start at the end where that is. I'm going to start halfway down. So I'm going to line that up perfectly. And then I want to end where this is. So I want to make sure this pin doesn't move. And I just want to sew straight down here until I get to where that pin is. And I want to finish with it in the down position, so just hand wind it if you don't have a computerized machine. So I'm finishing with it there. You can do a couple of reverse stitches if you want to, but there's no need to. And then I'm just turning it like this, and I can now take that pin out, and I just need to stitch across. So it's 4 stitches across. I've already checked that, and I need to now just come back the other way, and I want to make sure it's perfectly lined up with this and with my green in the middle. And I'm just going to sew all the way to this end pin and just do exactly the same at this end as I did the first end. And then I can turn it around, and that is going to line up perfectly with the stitching where I started. And once I get over that point there, just go past a couple of stitches and do a couple of reverse stitches there. Oh, I think I've hit a pin. What have I done? Oh, I've broken a needle. So try not to do that. Not even sure what I broke that on, but that is my bit now sewn on. So that's all now sewn on nice and neatly. You can see it a little bit better from that side. So I can take out my stitching that goes down the middle now. I don't need that. And then what I need to do is I need to cut it exactly the same as I did on the last one, but I need to cut it on both sides. So I tend to cut mine independently, just because with fabric this thick, it's kind of hard to do it all in one go. If you're making something with a much lighter fabric, then you could just do this all in one go. But all you need to do is just cut it exactly the same as the last one I did, down the middle, and then cut into those corners. And that's your buttonhole cut open. So what I need to do now is I need to tuck this through so I can take out my tacking. I don't need that anymore. And that's why you just put nice big stitches in, because it takes seconds to take that back out. So what I need to do now is just put this through here. So just take your time doing that. If you've used quite a big bit like me, you don't want to accidentally break your fabric, or fray it I should say. Break's a bit of an odd word to use with fabric. So that all just needs to come through to the inside. Now obviously you don't need a piece as big as this, but when I'm doing a demonstration I don't want this to look too fiddly. We need to just get this to look like this. So what I can't do is leave it like that. It looks like a little letterbox. We don't want that. What I need to do, if I put it like this, is I need to fold this up a little bit so that those meet, and then when I turn it over, I've just guessed that it's not going to be right, but it needs to look like the finished buttonhole on this side. So you just need to really play around with it. So I know that the total is going to be 8mm. So each of these have got to be 4mm, and we're talking tiny little measurements, but just fiddle around with it until those look right. And then what I'm going to do initially is just put a pin through there, kind of hard with this fabric, just to hold that in place. So I know that that's right now, and I can look at it from this side. And what I'm going to do, just like the other one, is I'm going to do that all the way along, and I'm going to put some tacking in just to hold it in place. So all I'm doing is basically just putting some stitches in here just to hold it together. I don't want to be doing this with the pin in, so I can take that out now. And you just need to make sure this is even all the way along, and if it's not, just take your tacking out and just do it again. And it's the end bits that are the most fiddly, and that's really all you need to do. Once you get the hang of doing these, you don't have to do all of these steps, but it's always good when you've not done it before just to tack a few things just to hold them into place. So that now looks right from this side, and what I need to do now is I need to finish the bits off from this side. So it's the same kind of principle as before with these little triangles, and I'm going to do that on either side, but I'm also going to do a little bit of stitching here as well to hold that in place. So let's do one little bit at a time. So on this side here, this is basically folded. You end up with this little pleat, and I'm just going to put a pin in there to hold that in place. Again, you can tack it if you want to, but it's just that little bit there, and that means that when I bring this up like this, this is where I need to sew it. So what I don't want to do is have this stretched out and then I can't sew it properly. So I've got that now pinned both sides. I think that side's come out a little bit. My fabric is so fluffy that it won't hold it in place very well. So there we go, that's better. So what I need to do first is exactly the same as what I did on the other buttonhole, and I'm going to stitch across here, and that's going to hold that little bit in place. And then once I've done that, I'm going to show you while I've got the camera in this position. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this over, and I'm also going to sew this little bit here to this. And you don't have to do this bit, or you could do it by hand if you want, but I just find that it all helps it stay in place. If you've got a wool fabric, then a lot of this can be done with pressing and it just stays where you want it to. But if you're using a fabric like mine that isn't wool, it is not likely to stay exactly in place where you want it to. So all I'm doing is just exactly the same as before. Just sewing across that little triangle, a few stitches backwards and forwards to hold that in place. And I'll just do exactly the same on the other side, and then we can have a look. And then before I do the next step, I just need to make sure that is stitched properly on either side. And then I'm going to do these little bits down the side here. So as I said, you don't have to do this bit, but it helps it stay in place if you've not got a wool fabric. So hold it this way up, so you've got your little square like that. Have that face down, and you want to be pulling this over. I'm leaving the tacking in for now, but what you don't want to do is pull it. You want it just to sit quite naturally where it sits. And I'm using my zip foot again, and I've got my needle going a fair way over. And what I want to do is just put a few stitches down here, and I'm kind of having to feed it through. It's quite bulky, and you could do this by hand as well, or just skip this step, but I find that doing that just helps my buttonhole stay in place. So I'm going to do the same on the other side of this, and then we can have a look. So that's all now stitched in. This is securely on, and I can now take out my green stitching and double check that it works. And then the last thing we need to do is look at how to finish off the facing on these buttonholes. I've stitched over my green stitching there, so I just need to figure out where I've stitched over it so I can get that out. And obviously check that your button goes through and doesn't have too much space either side. And this is why you really need to do a practice run. You want to make sure you've got your measurements right. So that is done. I would obviously give that a good press. Even if you haven't got a wool that molds really well, you still want to be giving it a good press. And then what you can do once you're done, you can see I didn't even cut this properly square in the first place, is you can just trim a lot of the excess of that off. You don't want too much bulk in between the layers of your outer and your facing. And I tend to just snip those like that a little bit as well. And then if you want to, you can put a few little hand stitches in that just attaches this to this. Obviously don't go all the way through. You just want to stitch through a little bit so you can't see it from the outside. But once your facing's on, that should all stay in place perfectly. So that's both of the types of buttonholes now. You saw that I made them in completely different ways, but they look exactly the same. So I just need to show you now how to finish off the back of one of these. So it doesn't matter which one I do because it's exactly the same for both of them. And all you need to do is cut a little slit in your facing. Obviously you're going to need to put it in exactly the right place when you are doing this for real, but I need to just cut that to the length of the opening. And then I'm putting wrong sides together. So this will obviously be sewn where my centre front is if this was a coat, and I would measure this perfectly. You can cut these when you're actually cutting your fabric out. And all I need to do is just line this up. So if I put that pin in there and that one in there, that lines it up perfectly with my opening. And this will automatically sit in the right place because it's obviously going to be attached to a coat. But I'm just going to pin it like that just to get it in the right place. Make sure your button goes through with both layers. And then this is the fiddly bit. You need to turn this under, and this kind of fabric is very forgiving for doing things like this too. But you need to just turn it under the whole length and just do some hand stitching to sew that along there. So I'm going to get a matching thread this time and I will show you how to sew that on. So I'm starting in the middle. I've already got this side obviously pinned. I'm going to take that one out because it's in the way a little bit. And I'm literally just doing a very basic stitch just to hold that in place. Kind of hard with this bulky fabric to show you because I'm imagining you probably can't see much detail. It's so hairy. But that is the other good thing with coat fabrics, is when they're nice and hairy like this, it makes it that little bit easier to do these kind of finishes. So I'm just sewing that down to the end, and you need to make sure that your cut end, and you need to make sure that your cut end goes all the way to the end of your buttonhole. And I'm just going to fix that in there. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same down this side. I won't put any pins in because I think it probably makes it harder to see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to carry on down the other side, exactly the same, just turning that in a little bit as I go. I should have used a contrast fabric, shouldn't I, for this buttonhole so you could have seen it a little bit better. But anyhow, that's what I need to do. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same round this end, and then I'll finish off in the middle. And that's how nice and neat it looks when it's all finished off. And obviously check that your button still fits through nicely. But that is the finished buttonhole, and it works for any kind of outerwear, jackets, suit jackets. You can make these whatever size you want. Just make sure they're not too fiddly. This is probably about as narrow as you can get going this way before it gets too fiddly. But obviously the finer the fabric, the easier this is going to be. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and it has given you a lot more information on how to do different types of buttonholes for these kind of coats. If you've got any questions, if anything's not clear, please ask in the comments. I always get back to people. And if you do want to see that hand-stitched buttonhole, do please let me know, because that's another tutorial I could consider making too. So you can see the full tutorial for this coat that I'm wearing as well. I have put a link in the description, and I'm going to be making more coats as well. So if there's any kind of design that you would like to see in a coat, please ask in the comments. I can't make every video I'm ever asked for, but if a few people ask for the same thing, then it does give me a good idea where to go next with my tutorial. So if you've enjoyed this tutorial, please like and share this video, as it helps me grow my channel. The more likes and shares I get and the more subscribers, it means I can grow my channel and make more videos. I try to make a new one every single week.